Thank you very much. I think this will make it a little bit easier for us to connect. We have a presentation that we would like to make, and then afterwards there are lots of things that would be interesting to discuss. I'm Brian, by the way.
I'm Nikita.
We're here from an anarchist collective that is trying to overthrow capitalism, hierarchy, all these different things. Tonight we will not be talking so much about the projects of our collective as about something a little bit larger, which is the anti-capitalist struggle in the United States. We'll be giving the presentation in English. If I say something that is unclear, just raise your hand, interrupt me, ask what I mean. And I really appreciate y'all having us here. I hope that this can be an interesting discussion for all of us.
So, we are here to talk to you today as anarchists. So, to get started, we want to take just a minute to talk a little bit about what that means to us. Some of the ideas, of course, will be familiar already. We want freedom. We want the ability to do whatever we want with our lives, with our energy, with our labor and our potential. We have no interest in the state. We are not here trying to promote democracy because we're not interested in trying to figure out the most fair or participatory way that we can give away our freedom to representatives. What we want is self-determination without government. We're here because we want to talk about the movements against capitalism. We want a world based on mutual aid, where we get the things that we need as we produce the things that we can. We have no interest in borders or nations or police, prisons, all of these things. But I'm sure that you've heard most of these ideas before. And for us, to be an anarchist, it's not just a list of the things that we believe in. It's a more passionate way to live our lives. Because every time that we can find a new revolt in our daily lives against the hierarchies that hold us in, every new rebellion against the alienation that we feel, this is what makes our lives worth living. So, we hope that the ideas that we talk about will be interesting to you, but we also hope that we can communicate some of this passion that we feel for trying to live lives of resistance. So, we're here to talk about struggles against capitalism from an anarchist perspective. Now, why is that important? There's lots of critiques of capitalism out there. Well, for one, we're not just interested in replacing the ruling class with a different class. In fact, when we talk about overthrowing capitalism, we don't just mean reorganizing the economy. We mean a whole new way to think about value, about what's really important in our lives. And we're talking about capitalism not because we think it's the only system that keeps our lives miserable. In fact, every form of hierarchy that constrains us, from racism and sexism to heterosexism and the destruction of the environment, all of these are systems that we have to struggle against simultaneously. And we don't think that these are just growths of capitalism, that they're just consequences of it. But we do think that capitalism is a place where all of these are tied together in important ways. And that's one of the reasons why the struggles that we've seen that are opening up new possibilities in the U.S. and across the world are particularly interesting to focus on. We don't think that you have to be an expert or have read everything by Karl Marx in order to understand capitalism or how the economy works. In fact, we think that no matter where you're positioned, inside of it or outside of it, that you can find a way to fight against capitalism. So, to get started, we want to talk a little bit about the ways that people have found each other in the past to fight against capitalism. Where did we come together? On what basis? And how did it work? What were the possibilities? What were the limits? And then we want to look at the way that the economy has changed today and the lessons that we have to learn and the new forms of resistance that have potential.
So, to talk about anti-capitalist resistance. The first kind of anti-capitalist resistance, of course, is from outside of capitalism, from those who are being attacked by capitalist forces, indigenous struggles, or you might think of the Luddites, But today, capitalism has spread almost over the entire world. It's not a coincidence that we are having this discussion in a university building rather than in the tundra, So, the kinds of anti-capitalist resistance we're going to talk about here, we're going to talk about three kinds. Struggles that start in production, struggles that start in consumption, and finally, struggles that start in precarity. Now, this is a moment at which maybe you should raise your hand and say, what is precarity?
What is that?
Well done. Yes. You know this word precarious. Your position in the economy is unstable, right? This is something that is common to more and more people in capitalism today. That we don't have steady places in the economy. That we don't have a steady position that we can hold. Now, in some parts of the world, people are talking about the precariat, as if it was a small part of the working class that has an unstable position. But we think that precariousness, that precarity, is extending to more and more parts of our lives and more parts of the economy of the world. So we're going to be talking about that last. But first I want to talk about struggles that begin in production. This is the old-fashioned idea, the idea that many Marxists had about how capitalism would be overthrown. We would come together in the factories with our big muscles, and our tools. We would occupy the factories, seize the means of production, and use it to mass produce a proletarian utopia, right? Now, this dream has not come true. I'd like to talk about why it has not come true, at least in the United States. It seems to me that in struggles that begin from production, there are two different ideas mixed together. One of them is the idea that we deserve complete control of our lives, of our potential. That it shouldn't just be that we get to make whatever we want in the factories, but that we get to make whatever we want to of ourselves. Right? This is an idea I would call an anarchist idea, a revolutionary idea. The other idea is the idea that it's okay that we spend our lives in the factories, but we deserve a little bit more in return, a little bit more, of a wage or something. If you make a television in a factory, you deserve to own a television, something like this. This is an idea I would call a reformist idea. Now, in the United States, in the 19th century, these two currents, these two ideas were mixed together. And it wasn't always possible to tell one from the other, because the unions were all basically illegal. And the same group of people that would protest for higher wages, sometimes, another time they would be burning down a factory, But the way to destroy a movement is to break it into the reformist and revolutionary parts. You grant some of the reforms, crush the revolutionaries. We see this happen in the United States starting with Henry Ford. Ford is producing automobiles. He knows that if he can make the automobiles cheaper, he can sell more of them and make more money. To make them cheaper, he has to treat the workers like they're machines, right? The first year that he does this, 1914, 9 out of every 10 workers quit. It's very difficult for him to keep workers in his factories. So he starts paying them more. Paying the workers more creates something that I'm going to call the Fordist compromise. A compromise between capitalists and workers, where the workers are now able to buy back some of what they make. Okay, you give your life up working in a factory, but maybe you can buy a car one day. This is the origins of the middle class in the United States. A group of people who have a role in production, but also feel that they have a stake in capitalism, because it gives them some of what they need, right? This is also the end of unions as a revolutionary force in the U.S., because the unions are given a role inside of capitalism. If you have an economy that's based on mass production and mass consumption, somebody has to force capitalists to keep the wages high enough that workers can buy the things that they mass produce. And the unions take on this role. In return for becoming legal, they give up the demand for us to have our whole lives in our hands. And instead, they only demand higher wages, better conditions. They stabilize this compromise inside of capitalism between workers and capitalists. This is why we haven't seen revolutionary struggles that started from production in the United States since my grandfather was a little boy.
But not everyone is included in this compromise that Brian has spoken about, that was created to give some workers a feeling of investment in capitalism by helping them buy some of the things that they produce. In fact, the first law that makes it legal for unions to organize in the U.S., it excludes two groups of people. The first group is domestic workers. That's people who work in the home, which will be mostly women at this time. And the second group is agricultural workers who grow food or pick it in the field. And that will be mostly immigrants or people of color. So you can see that in the way this compromise is structured, it takes the sexism and the racism that are already at the foundation of the society and the economy, and they tie it into this compromise so that the people who are included can feel like they have more of a stake in keeping capitalism running than challenging the whole system by challenging the oppression that runs underneath it. So this situation continues through the 20th century, and it frames the social movements that emerged to struggle against racism, the civil rights movement, to struggle against sexism, and the feminist movement. So as these movements are growing stronger, in the 1950s, 1960s, just as Brian said about the struggles in production, there are revolutionaries and there are reformers. The revolutionaries say, we don't want anything that this racist, sexist system has to offer. We want to tear it all down and create something new for ourselves. But the reformers can say, we just want to be included in this compromise. For example, we want more women to be able to have jobs in the wage labor force, or protection against discrimination on the basis of race in hiring for jobs. And again, also as Brian said, the strategy of the state to crush a potentially revolutionary movement is to divide it into the revolutionaries, who can be crushed, and the reformers, who can have a few of their demands granted to keep the system running. So, a few more people get included in this compromise, but without challenging the racism and sexism that are still at the foundation of the society.
So I was talking about my grandfather. I don't know how things are here in Finland, but in the U.S., my grandfather had the same job for 50 years, right? He was part of this compromise I'm describing. He worked for a rubber factory his whole life. Does anybody here think that you're going to get a job and have the same job for 50 years?
No.
Yeah? You do, maybe?
I don't know, it's a little precarious nowadays.
Yeah. Right. In the U.S., you could probably only keep the same job your whole life now if you were a police officer, you know. But I also want to emphasize that being part of this compromise was not even that great for my grandfather. I know it wasn't good for him because his children's generation rebelled against him and the compromises that he had been part of. This is my parents' generation. You're thinking the 1960s, you know. We were talking before about struggles that begin in production. In the 1960s, we see struggles that begin with consumption. You know, people who say, I don't just want a mass-produced, middle-class dream. I want to be an individual. I want to be unique, you know. I want to be special in some way. You know, the people who grew up listening to Elvis together and then started listening to the Beatles together, who came into a consciousness of themselves as opposed to their parents' generation by the music they were listening to, by the clothes they were wearing. And through this demand to become unique. Of course, this doesn't sound like a revolutionary program to us today because we know that that's how capitalism was expanded, how the market became bigger, that this demand to be unique could be granted by a more broad diversity of products. Well, you want to be unique, no problem. Instead of the books that everybody else reads, we'll sell you this book, and maybe you don't want this book, maybe you want something else, There's a product for every identity.
And this logic of social movements that come together around consumption, around our subcultures, what we buy together, this influences the social movements that continue to struggle against oppression in the society. So, if in the early years of this compromise, the important thing was conformity, everybody looking the same, dressing the same, buying the same products, in this new era, where resistance more and more happens on the basis of consumption, what's important is diversity. Everybody looking different or buying things differently, so long as that difference is expressed through the market, through commodities. So this logic continues to influence the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, as the 1980s and 1990s come. For example, some of the demands that we heard in these movements during those years were things like, we need better images of women in the media, or let's have more racial diversity in television programs. And of course, the mass media is an important part of how people experience society, and we should fight racism and sexism everywhere we see it in the society. But these are the kinds of demands that companies are happy to grant, because if more people can feel invested in the consumer economy, if more people can be brought into the mass consumption compromise, then the market can just expand. And again, none of this challenges the racism or sexism that are still at the basis of the economy and the society, but it can keep capitalism running a little bit longer by adding more fuel to the fire.
So with my parents' generation, the demands that they made to be individuals, to be unique, actually helped to expand the market, right? To stabilize capitalism, to show a space where it could grow. But this is not just my parents' history, this is also my history, and perhaps your history. Is anybody in this room right now, because when you were young you started listening to a kind of music called punk rock? Raise your hand. Right. This is what I'm talking about. Struggles that begin from consumption, that begin from the clothes we wear, the music we listen to, I understand why this seemed like a revolutionary demand. I also think it's important to understand why punk rock is not going to produce the next generation of anarchists. I'd like to make an argument for this. In the 1980s, when I was a young person, I listened to, Pink Floyd, right? Now, it's easy as a youngster listening to Pink Floyd to realize that you're never going to get to be in Pink Floyd. There is one president of the United States and one Pink Floyd, and the rest of us are just down here, voting and buying tickets, right? This is bullshit, actually. We should be free. We should be equals, So the demand, the do-it-yourself demand, is for a society based on horizontal, decentralized production and consumption, where we make ourselves the things that we need and share them, This seems like a revolutionary demand. There's another version of this. Did you have this slogan here in Finland 10 years ago, become the media? Was that here at all? Somebody in the back? Yeah, a little bit. This was a big slogan in the United States just 10 years ago. Become the media. Again, it sounds revolutionary, right? Forget about having these big corporations that give us the information. We should have a horizontal, decentralized network through which we spread information ourselves. It sounds revolutionary. Now, what happens today if you walk around Tampere? You see people at a bus stop or in a grocery store or something. What is everybody doing? What did you do before this event, and what will you do again after?
They try to log into Facebook with their telephones.
Yes.
Maybe not coffee anymore, but or something.
Yeah, exactly. You know, this is a situation in which we have become the media, right? Everywhere you go, you see people doing this. We have a horizontal, decentralized network through which information travels. What this means is that we identified something that was missing from capitalism in a way that enabled corporations to expand the market, to find a new way to sell us something that we would need, you know? Today, punk rockers aren't the only ones who offer the opportunity to do it yourself or to become the media. In fact, it's easier to do it yourself on YouTube than it is to go to the trouble of starting a band, you know? We've created, through our demands, a situation in which capitalism is stabilized by making this part of life, a new part of the economy, a new part of our lives. And now we can't, in fact, imagine doing without it.
So we made the most radical demands that we thought we could make from inside this framework of resistance based on consumption to do it ourselves, to become the media. And this demand was granted, but it didn't make us free. Quite the opposite. In fact, every time that we upload a new video onto YouTube or update our profile on Facebook, what we're doing is free labor that a few companies can profit from. And we don't see any of that in return. And in fact, everyone who participates in these horizontal networks of communication and media, we're all doing free labor in a way that in the long run is actually making us all more unstable in the economy. Is there a question over there?
I have a question.
With the dreadlocks?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and yeah, sure, okay, but like Facebook, didn't it make a revolution in Africa or something? Isn't it kind of cool?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let's talk about that. So, yeah, I mean, maybe Facebook, Twitter, things like this, maybe they can be sucked into the economy to create value for capitalists, but aren't they also tools for resistance to the state as well? Can't we fight oppression and hierarchy using these decentralized tools to become the media? Well, yes, of course, but it's not quite that simple. So let's take an example. Twitter. Do any of you know how Twitter was first invented? Well, I'll tell you. It turns out that Twitter was invented not by some big company in California, but by anarchists in the US in 2004 who were preparing for a protest against the Republican National Convention in New York City. It wasn't called Twitter back then. It was called Text Mob. And what it was a program where if you had a mobile phone, you could plug into this network of other activists at the convention. And you could get updates every minute about where the police were headed or where the Black Bloc was going. And it was helpful. It gave us one step ahead of the police in their repression. Move forward 2 or 3 years. There's a new company looking for a hot idea to generate some sales. They take this technology, update it a little bit, call it Twitter, and boom, somebody is getting really rich off of these ideas that were first developed for resistance. So we're not actually surprised that Twitter, for example, is being used to overthrow governments in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere. In fact, that's what it was designed for. The question that we have is, why haven't these technologies helped us to overthrow more governments? Why haven't they helped us resist the state more effectively in the places where they were developed? To answer that, we need to look at the way that these new processes of communicating through these networks that seem decentralized, that are DIY, that they're putting all of that communication and connection into a map, into a grid that makes it even easier for the state and these companies to surveil us and then to repress us. And we've seen examples of this already. In the UK, with the big riots last year, now the police are doing a big campaign of going back through the Twitter feeds to send people to prison for participating in the riots. Because if they sent out a tweet saying that resistance was happening here, or you could go here to participate in a riot, then that can be grounds for sending people to jail, when the old informal communication networks wouldn't be able to be traced in that same way. And another example that hit even closer to home for us, Brian on his computer gets a feed from Twitter that says every time the name CrimethInc comes up on Twitter. So a few days ago, we looked in the computer and there was a message from somebody saying, "Oh, I'm so excited, this new book is coming out. Here, look at this picture." And it was supposed to be a picture of this book, Recipes for Disaster, which is a collection of practical strategies for resistance. But in fact, it was a message saying, "Sorry, this image cannot be displayed due to content restrictions. Thanks, Twitter." What happened? Well, it turns out that Twitter, just by clicking a box, can decide that anarchist revolutionary material, or whatever they want, can't be seen, isn't appropriate content for people who use Twitter. And it's only one more step, one more box to check, to say that those tweets can't even go out at all, that we never would have known that someone tried to send this message in the first place. So again, this is an example of the way that putting all of our communication and connection through these networks makes repression even easier. One more example. A couple of years ago, some friends of ours were arrested at a May Day demonstration. When the government gave them a list of the evidence that was going to be used in the court case, we looked through it, hundreds of pages of evidence, and half of it were posts from Facebook. It used to be that the government would spend tons of money every year trying to make a map of the relationships between radical activists. Now, we do that for free, better than they ever could in the first place. And not just through Facebook, but through our mobile phone records, through the other websites that we use. So, we're not saying that we should never use these technologies. Many of you may be here today because of Facebook or something. And that's fine, but we want to make sure that it's clear that this demand that seemed like the most revolutionary direction we could go, starting from a politics of consumption, of shared subculture, things like this, that it can only go so far when it can be met inside of the market. Because for every step forward that these new participatory, become the media technologies allow us to take in resistance and connecting with each other, the repression and surveillance that they make possible push us 2 steps back.
So this explains why we think that we won't see more revolutionary potential arise from struggles in production or starting from consumption, right? This brings us to the third kind of anti-capitalist resistance that we want to talk about today, which is the struggles that begin from precarity. Today, our friends build castles for rich people to have meetings in, and then they take the castles apart. They're not producing anything of value. They're not producing anything that would be useful in a post-capitalist world. And this is, in fact, what the majority of people are doing.
So, even though most people in the U.S. today who have a steady job work in the service sector, it's harder and harder to find a stable job even there. So what can you do? What can you do to give yourself some kind of advantage in hopes of catching a job in this sector? Well, more and more what we have to do is make our whole lives into commodities for the market. I'll give an example. I applied one time for a job at a bar to be a bartender. So walked in and said, "Hi, I'd like to work at your bar." And the boss says, "Okay, well sure, show me your Facebook profile." I said, "What? I don't have a Facebook profile. Why would I have to have a Facebook profile just to apply for a job?" Well, the boss didn't want to have to pay me for the free labor that I would do to make a big list of friends who would all come see me when I worked at the new bar. He didn't want to have to pay me to list all of my cool interests so that other people could search for people who have those cool interests to find a place to hang out. He didn't want to have to pay for the free advertising of when I post photographs of my working at the new bar to spread around my group of friends. So all of these things that used to be my private life, my hobbies, my interests, even my friendships and my relationships, all of these get sucked into the process of creating value for the capitalist market. But what happens if you don't have a Facebook profile, or you don't have any social capital that you can use to get a job in one of these service areas? Well, chances are you might find yourself doing temporary labor. This means jobs that you just hold for a month or a week, maybe even just one day. Lots of people that we know wake up in the morning and get on the computer to look at a list of the day labor jobs that are available in a given town. You might be mowing the lawn for somebody, or writing a paper for a university student, or having sex with a rich person. But whatever it is, all of these temporary jobs have two things in common. The first is that there's no security. Just because you have a job today, it doesn't mean that you're going to have the same job, or any job at all, tomorrow. And the second thing is that you're not just competing against other people who have the same education that you do, or who work in the same industry. You have to compete against everyone in the whole society, sometimes around the world, who are also precarious, who also no longer have a stable job in the economy.
So what else do people do in a precarious economy? Well, what happened to the Mexican workers who worked in the factories that moved there from the United States after those factories left Mexico to go further west? They got involved in two different kinds of illegal capitalism. The first kind is the drug trade, which is huge in Mexico and the United States. And the second kind is crossing illegally into the United States to work there, right? When I say crossing illegally into the U.S., I don't mean that people went across the border, just to work for a few months and then take the money back. There are between 12 and 20 million people who live permanently in the United States without papers, working legal jobs for illegally low wages, because without documents, they have no rights at all. Right? And without this part of the population, the economy in the United States would collapse. So we see that illegal capitalism isn't something opposed to legal capitalism. It's an essential part of it to create a population that can be exploited more fiercely than any legal population could.
But what happens if you get caught? Well, then there's the next growth industry of the precarious economy: prison. In the U.S. today, 2.5 million people are in prison. This is more people than any government in history has locked up at one time. Why? Why so many people in prison in the U.S. today? Well, the U.S. uses prisons as a way to solve social problems. When unemployment is too high, then you could put those people in prison. When the state wants to save money so that they don't have to pay to help people who have mental health problems or addictions, then those people are stored in prison. In the cities, when there are rebellions of people who have no hope or no future in the economy, then those people go to prison. So this creates a situation where prison is a warehouse for the surplus population of people who've been excluded from the economy. And it's also a pool of slave labor, of people who work for no wage at all, or just a tiny one, in a way that makes everybody in the economy less stable, whether you're in prison or outside of it.
Prison is not the worst thing that can happen to you in the United States. There are people who try to get into prison just so they can survive the winter, right? The homeless, the jobless. Some cities in the U.S. you walk around and you see homeless people everywhere you look. And because we are in a globalized market, those people are basically in the same position as the 1 billion people around the world who live in shanty towns, who live in favelas. When we're talking about a precarious economy, this is the result of this global capitalism. That humanity is being spit out in the desert produced by capitalism with no other recourse and not even being necessary to the system around us. This is the starting place for the question that we have to ask now about what resistance will look like in this context. Because the reforms that brought the old struggles to a standstill, to a deadlock, don't do anything to address the needs of this precarious population.
So, now we get to the interesting part. We want to ask the question with this presentation, how are we going to topple capitalism in the 21st century? And this is obviously a really big question. So, maybe we should break it down a little bit. The first question that we want to ask is, who is going to be struggling against capitalism in the years to come? What groups of people? On what basis? How are we going to come together? And to answer this, we're arguing that production and consumption, our roles in our workplaces and the subcultures that we're part of or the things that we buy, that these are not going to be the places that will grow, that will expand for anti-capitalist resistance in the future. Now let's be clear. Of course, workers will still organize in their workplaces, form unions, and occupy factories. And this is great. We want this to continue. Likewise, people will still form punk bands and hip-hop groups and politicize each other through music. And this is great. This should happen too. But because of these changes in the economy, we don't think that these are going to be the places that will grow in the way that they did in previous generations. Instead, we think that today, resistance will be based more and more not on having a stable role in production, but on not having a stable role in the economy. On the thing that we share most, which is vulnerability, our insecurity and our instability inside of the economy. And again, this is not just a fixed group of people at the bottom of the flexible market. This is in fact a dynamic, a relationship that's spreading all through the economy and affecting more and more people. So, to talk more about this, we want to ask some questions about social movements in the U.S. today. We want to ask what social movements have hit a wall, haven't been able to go further, but what social movements have continued, and how did people come together in those movements that allowed new possibilities to emerge in the struggle against capitalism.
Right. To give an example of what we're talking about, when I say social movements in the United States, what is the first one that occurs to you from the last couple of years? Whether you like it or not. Occupy, right? Every night somebody says this, and it's true. And it's important for us to understand why Occupy was able to take off. Whether we like it or not. Whether Occupy is the movement that we would like to see replace capitalism or not. And for me, it's not that movement, you know. For me, Occupy has many drawbacks, but it got one thing right, and that's that it started from the right place. Let me explain what I mean. Occupy was not the first attempt to have an anti-capitalist movement in the U.S. after the economic crisis hit in 2008. The first thing that happened, in fact, was that workers occupied their workplace in Chicago. And this was big news around the U.S. Obama said that he supported them. What could go wrong? You know? But nobody else occupied a workplace. It didn't spread. And I think it didn't spread for the reasons that we've been describing, that today, if there's an obstacle to trade somewhere, that capital just goes somewhere else, you know? If you occupy your workplace, you know, you wake up the next day and your workplace is on the other side of the planet. The next thing that happened was students occupied their school in New York. This spread a little bit further. More students imitated them in California. But it didn't keep spreading. It stopped spreading. Why is that? Well, let's say this year you're a student protesting against the increase in your tuition. Well, next year you're just some poor motherfucker who can't afford to go to school, right? You can't build a long-term struggle around a position in the economy that you can't hold on to. The next thing that happened in early 2011 was state employees who were having their wages cut and their union rights taken away occupied the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin. This was really big news. But again, it didn't spread. And it's strange that it didn't spread because state employees were having their wages and rights taken away all around the country. Right? And to say, why didn't this spread? Well, if you look at pictures from Wisconsin, you see photographs of people holding signs that say, "Defend the middle class." Now, I think in the economy that we've been describing, it's impossible for one class to defend itself alone. You know? Because, in a situation where you can take the middle class and just replace them with the lower middle class, how is one group of people going to go on strike or protest and defend themselves? You know? Actually, it would take the entire population to defend the rights of one class. And I'm not middle class. What reason do I have to defend people who have never done anything to look out for me? Right? I think this is why it didn't spread. The one movement that was able to spread was a movement based outside of the workplace, based outside of what people produce or consume. A movement that was based on the way that all of us are increasingly vulnerable and unstable in capitalism. And as soon as there was one occupation in New York, starting from this place, within a few weeks, there were 400 occupations around the country. Because this is something that everyone has in common now. So, I think it's important for us to understand from this that this old idea that we would occupy our workplaces, whether or not it was ever a good idea, it's a reactionary idea today. The people who have the right to take over workplaces are the ones who have no steady jobs. It's a reactionary idea to say students should occupy their schools. The people who should occupy schools are the ones who can't afford to go to school. We have to stop identifying with our roles in the economy, which are being taken away from us anyway, and create a struggle based on the way that we are external to it, the way that we are useless to it, and the possibility that we could abolish it.
So if this is some idea about how people are going to come together to fight capitalism and the dynamics that will bring us together, the next question that we have is, what are we going to do? What are the tactics? What are the practices that can help us make movements? Because while many social movements start based off of an ideology or a set of goals, the thing that brings them together, makes them coherent, and keeps them going is finding a common practice, finding something people can do together to hold that movement together. And so to answer this, again, we want to ask about some of these social movements in North America. What are the practices that weren't able to hold together, and what movements showed new practices that give us some ideas about the directions we'll need to take with our resistance?
Right. Because as soon as I say something about Occupy, your first question should be, if Occupy is so great, why did it only last a few months? Where is it now? You know? The occupations lasted, like I said, a few months, and then the police came in most cities and forced them out in a coordinated wave of attacks. Everyone said, oh, we'll be back in spring. Nobody was back in spring. I actually think this shows some wisdom on the part of people in the U.S. People learned that just holding signs was not going to be enough to change their situation. Now, there are a couple places where the movement lasted longer and went further. When I say Occupy, what is the city you think of that was the most interesting? Where the movement became the most fierce? Wall Street. Actually, one more guess. Oakland. Occupy had died down on Wall Street, actually, months before things slowed down in Oakland. In Oakland in January, they were still having serious actions when things were totally dead in New York. I'm going to explain why I think this is. In most cities, once people were forced out of the parks, there was no second step for them, you know? They were just like, oh, we've been forced out, we'll go back home. In Oakland, when people were forced out of the plaza, they immediately strategized again and said, okay, we need to do something more, we need to take this further, right? In Oakland, they called a general strike a year ago, last November. What does a general strike look like in 2011? The last general strike in the United States happened in 1946, during the compromise that I was saying my grandfather was part of. All that had to happen then was for people to leave their workplaces, and the city was shut down. What does it look like to have a general strike when everyone works a different job every day? When more people are working in coffee shops than are working in factories? Is the economy going to crash without the coffee? Does it just mean that we all stay home for one day? That's not actually a general strike, right? So in Oakland last year, to make there be a general strike, they had to come up with a new strategy. They went to the ports and shut the ports down. They went to the business district and blocked business, shut the business district down. This is what it will take, actually, to have a movement in which people can do anything that is worth doing, in which people can wield force against the system that oppresses us, rather than just protesting powerlessly against it. You know? There's one more example of this. There's one city in North America where the movement went further than it went in Oakland, and that is Montreal. At the beginning of 2012, a student strike began in Montreal. The first thing the students did was they occupied their buildings. Now, the first thing the police did was they went and emptied those buildings. Silly students, Occupy is over. That is so 2011. The students could have given up, you know, and said, okay, you win, there's nothing else legal for us to do, so I guess I'll just vote for somebody else, you know. But instead they came up with a new strategy. Every day they were downtown blockading businesses, keeping businessmen out of their offices, interrupting business as usual. This is, again, what it takes to have the force for there to be a movement that is worth participating in, a movement that can exert some impact when all of us are precarious, when all of us are outside of fixed positions.
So if these are ideas about the kinds of practices that can keep movements going, the next question that we have is, what is our overall strategy? How are we going to work together to topple capitalism? Well, to answer this, we want to talk about the traditional strategy of the left. Now, in the US, it's a very different situation. We don't have any left parties in parliament. We don't have any large, strong socialist or communist organizations. There's not a sense of there being a radical left alternative in the system as there is in other parts of Europe that we've visited. But for people in the US who are inspired by a left tradition, then the strategy looks something like this. You find a group of people, maybe workers in one industry, students at a school, or an oppressed group. You help them organize to win a small reform. And then you help another group organize, and they win a small reform. And so if these groups realize that if they work together in solidarity, then they can help each other win a little bit bigger reform. So the strategy is based off of winning more and more reforms and helping more and more groups organize and work together and building until the biggest reform of all, revolution. Now, we don't think that this is the strategy that is going to succeed to overthrow capitalism today. Why not? Well, many of the reforms that these left groups have been demanding, they're not even possible inside of the precarious economy today. Because capitalism isn't a bad system just because the bosses and the politicians are mean people. It's a system that structurally rewards exploitation, rewards greed. So today, If you own a factory and your workers go on strike for better wages, more security, you could be the nicest person in the world and want to grant those demands, but the capital underneath your factory will just fly across the border, where exploitation is cheaper. So when we can't defend these fixed positions in the economy, a lot of these demands just aren't even possible. And this is true even for the state workers in the US, who are some of the last people clinging to that old compromise as it's melting away. So a strategy that's based off of winning small reforms, it's not going to succeed when we're not winning those reforms. In fact, of all the social movements that we've talked about so far, almost none of them have actually won any of the reforms that they were demanding, that they were fighting for. So in this situation, we have to think about strategy in a new way, because it just might be that today, revolution is actually more realistic than reform.
What does this mean, revolution is more realistic than reform? Well, it means, for example, that in Egypt there were workers' struggles for years, but it turned out to be easier to overthrow Mubarak than to win any reforms by themselves. This changes how we have to strategize about what we're doing. It means that perhaps we will lose most of the battles that we fight. We won't be able to get higher wages. We might not be able to protect some part of the environment. And again, I don't know how it is in Finland now, but in the US, this is a major issue, actually. All of the old reformist projects are failing. This creates a situation in which we have to be strategizing differently. If revolution is more realistic than reform, then what counts is not whether we win these battles, but whether, in the course of the battles, we demonstrate a way of fighting that can create a revolutionary situation. Whether we demonstrate a way of doing things that can break with capitalism completely. If we're able to do this, we could lose every battle. But if the way of fighting spreads, then ultimately we create a situation in which we can solve the problem, right? And this means that what happened in Egypt is most interesting, not because they created a post-capitalist utopia, they didn't, but because the way of fighting that they demonstrated there spread around the world.
So this brings us to the last question. What is the role for us? What can anarchists do? What can we do to participate in these struggles, to help them along? Well, I actually think that we can play an important role in struggles against capitalism today. In particular, two ways. The first is changing the sense of what's possible, and the second is changing our sense of what's legitimate, changing the sense of what we have a right to do. To change what's possible, this means experimenting with new tactics, pushing them further than they've ever been pushed before, to open up spaces where people can participate in things that they thought were impossible. This is especially important because one of the lessons that we've learned in the social struggles where we live is that many times people are willing to participate in actions that are more radical than the ideas that they say that they're willing to support. So when we create spaces in which new things feel possible, in which we can open up new senses of possibility, we've found that people will join us. The tactics will spread. And to change the sense of what's legitimate, of what we have a right to do in our movements, this means always being sure to explain our actions in a context that challenges all authority. When we participate in broader social movements, preventing them from being co-opted or taken over by authorities, whether that be from the left or the right. We don't see ourselves as being a vanguard. We're not the most important people or the center of a revolutionary struggle. But we do have an important role to play. Because for us, with this new way of thinking about our strategy, we're not just trying to win anarchist victories for anarchists. In fact, what we're trying to do is to take tactics that spread power horizontally instead of vertically. Anarchist tactics. Tactics that challenge all authority. And spread them past the group of people who define ourselves as anarchists out into the vast economy of people who are more and more precarious, who have less and less of a stake in trying to defend the old compromises. And when we can do this, when we can spread tactics that challenge authority past ourselves into more and more of the population, then this is when we have a real chance to contribute something to the revolutionary struggle.
So to conclude, I'd like to tell you all a story of us trying to do this in our little town back in the United States. We come from a town smaller than Tampere, a town of 60,000 people in the south, which is the poorer part of the U.S. Not Oakland, not New York, you know. But we come from a town where there are some anarchists. Maybe not as many as there are people in this room right now, but there are some anarchists, and we are organized, and we do a lot of things. So, in 2011, when Occupy was spreading around the country, we had a meeting in our town to decide what to do. On the one hand, people said, Occupy is not exactly what we want to see. What is this 99% politics? This is very strange, actually. On the other hand, Occupy seemed to us to be a genuinely social movement, a movement that involved a lot of different people who didn't know what they thought yet, you know. And if we didn't connect with these people, you know, maybe reactionaries or fascists would connect with them. So we decided, okay, we will organize the beginning of the Occupy group for our town. We called for the first meeting. And on that first day, there were more than 100 people in the plaza in the center of our little town. Some of the people we've been talking about here, the students who know that there aren't jobs waiting for them after school. People who work, but work a different job every month, you know. Homeless people. Left liberals who are concerned about what is happening. There's a discussion about what we should do. In this discussion, you know, somebody says, maybe we could have a protest once a week. Somebody else says, what if we imitate what they're doing in New York and we actually occupy this space? Someone else says, but is it legal to occupy this space? And one of the left liberals who has lots of organizing experience says, don't worry, we'll ask for permission. Building space to sleep. Because there's no squatting movement in our town, this wasn't understood as a subcultural group. This was understood as something that was for the general public. So lots of people are coming in off the street to see what we are doing, you know. The police come and they see that there's too many people there for them to handle, so they go back to headquarters to plan. Meanwhile, more than 100 people come into our building and look around and see the things we're doing, and their imaginations open up, and they can imagine a movement in which we would take back all of the things that have been stolen from us to transform our society. That night, there is a dance party in the building, and lots of people are there who have never been to our occupation in the plaza. Suddenly, people are interested in what we can do, you know, because we've showed that we can change the shape of our society. The next day, you know, after people sleep in the building and other people stand guard around it, you know, we have meetings all day. Finally, we've held the building for 24 hours, which is a miracle. It's a record. In Oakland, at the peak of Occupy Oakland, they took a building and they held onto it for 2 hours. You know? For us to hold this building for 24 hours, it's unimaginable. We're starting to think that we could actually keep it, that we've won something, you know. For once, we've won something. When a military armored vehicle comes crashing in the back door and the SWAT team fans out everywhere with the machine guns. Of course this happened. We're talking about the United States. What's interesting is that so many people in the town were angry about the SWAT team. If this had happened 2 months earlier, they wouldn't have cared. You know, they would have said, "Oh, the anarchists are getting in trouble again." You know, but in this situation, when their imaginations had expanded, they were there surrounding the police, shouting at them. That night, a black bloc of 100 people marched around our little town. Some of them were anarchists who had been involved for a long time. Others, many others, were people who had never done something like this, who had never thought they were anarchists, you know. The police were afraid to touch us because they knew that for once we were more connected to society than they were. My point here is we didn't win. We don't still have that building. We're not going to occupy one building after another to revolution. What we did that worked was that we fought in a way that demonstrated the possibility of a really anti-capitalist struggle, a struggle that abolishes private property and finally solves all of the problems that precarity creates that can't be solved any other way. This is the way that we think that we have to fight, and this is what connects us to the people struggling in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Greece, perhaps here. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Perhaps there are things that you'd like to discuss, questions.